Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in today to the Ron Paul Liberty Report. I'm Ron Paul, your host.
And I'm Daniel McAdams, your co-host. I'm the director of the Institute for Peace and Prosperity.
Great, and we have a special guest today. Do you happen to know somebody by the name of Paul Martin Foss?
I think I remember that name.
Yes. Well, I'm very glad to have you with us today, Paul Martin.
I'm very glad to be here, Dr. Paul. Thank you for having me on.
Well, good. You know, as we speak, there's still a hearing going on in the U.S. Senate, and it has something to do with a subject that you and I have spoken about for quite a few years, seeing that you were the key legislative assistant to me in the Banking and Financial Services Committee. And many a day we watched this, and you were very, very instrumental in helping to put the coalition together to get the Congress, the House at least, to pass for the first time Audit the Fed bill. But I don't know if you've gotten to watch everything, probably not, that's going on. But tell me, what do you think is going to come? Do you think there'll be any startling changes in monetary policy as a consequence of this hearing today?
Oh, no, definitely not. It's funny. My father was listening to some of the testimony too, and he said, are these senators going to take Janet Yellen out for lunch afterwards? Are they going to buy her some champagne? I mean, this type of thing is just one big dog and pony show. They're so chummy with her. They never ask hard-hitting questions. And you know, the Fed loves to say, oh, we're so transparent and Congress has so much oversight. We come up twice a year to answer all your questions, and you get 5 minutes and you end up asking these complete softballs. So yeah, I don't see anything. Yeah.
Right. Same old stuff. But, you know, the markets are open. They do respond. And, you know, right at the beginning of the hearings, I caught a headline on the internet, and it says, Treasuries fluctuate after Yellen signals Fed to be flexible. Now, I wonder why things would fluctuate when her policies are going to be very flexible. But a little bit later on, it said the treasuries go up, in price. So this is rather characteristic of nobody knowing exactly what's going on, every single word. Just remember how you used to dissect out and look at every word that's ever said in these statements. So I can't see where we should expect too much from this.
No, definitely not. But I think a lot of people were still expecting a interest rate rise sometime in June, and by Yellen saying, "Oh, we're not going to have it for another couple FOMC meetings," people are starting to think, "Well, maybe it's not going to come. Maybe it's not going to come," and maybe we'll have low interest rates or zero interest rates through the end of the year now. So I think people are probably a little optimistic, or at least some of the markets are optimistic about that.
Good. Daniel, do you have a question for him? Maybe something about the Audit the Fed. We all in our office talked about Audit the Fed for many a year.
Yeah, I did notice that she was asked about the Audit the Fed legislation, and there's a quote that she said, I strongly oppose Audit the Fed. Audit the Fed is a bill that would politicize monetary policy, would bring short-term political pressures to bear on the Fed.
The Fed has been so politicized for so long. I mean, everything they've ever done. There was the famous quote, I think it was Arthur Burns back in the 70s, who was asked, well, you lowered interest rates for Nixon, you didn't do it for Ford. Well, why not? And he said, well, Ford didn't ask. I mean, to think that somebody who's on a 4-year cycle like this, Yellen in 3 more years is going to be up for another Senate confirmation hearing, and she's not going to do anything that is going to anger the president. If the president says jump, she's going to ask how high. It is. The Federal Reserve Board is a government agency. It may be independent somewhat independent of the executive. It's independent of Congress only to the extent that it's not funded through appropriations. But they still have to answer to Congress and answer to the president. And they're basically going to do what Congress and the president tell them to, and more so the president. Nowadays.
When Burns was asked that question by the media about whether they listen to the president, he says, yes, we do. Otherwise, we'd lose our independence if we didn't listen to it. But I found another quote just recently. I had not read about it. It's been around what Nixon said about independence and This is interesting. And Nixon said this was the time when Burns was being nominated in 1970. He says, "I respect his independence. I hope that independently he will consider that my views are the ones that should be followed." So the independent argument isn't very solid.
Right. That pretty much sums up the relationship between the president and the Federal Reserve Board. They basically follow the president's orders.
Right. Well, anyway, most of the time, everything hinges on a word or two that the chairman will say, and the markets react. And, the immediate reaction today so far has been markets are pretty healthy. But that doesn't mean that an hour or two from now, the fluctuations may come back again, because long term, this can't be good for the country. And even though it's good for stock markets, it seems like this is part of the game they play. Not too long ago, I had a conversation with Jim Grant about the plunge protection team, the president's working group on financial markets. And his answer was they didn't have to have a whole lot of committee work. There was one group in Washington that took care of the financial markets and keeping the stocks up. He said the Federal Reserve.
Right, right. And you're right, that they can't continue this, and it's not good for the country. I mean, I think Yellen in her comments on millennials, talking about how millennial generation is not purchasing houses, quite like previous generations have. I think she gets the impression that it's more of a cultural shift, and I really think it's more of it has to do with monetary policy. I mean, this country is so deep in debt, and you have zero interest rates, so there's no incentive to save because you put your money in the bank and you're literally losing value to inflation. So that you've got this, the Fed is spurring so much consumption. My generation, I'm in my, early 30s. Our generation goes out to dinner every single night. Nobody saves, nobody invests. It's just a freewheeling, almost hedonistic type of culture. We want the very best of food and living now for the moment. 20, 30 years from now, we're not going to have any savings built up, but part of that is just due to this low interest rate environment. There just is not a great economy, not great investing opportunities, and we have the Federal Reserve to thank for that.
It's real hard to predict, especially under these conditions of the Fed having control of interest rates and all, but everybody anticipates, the investors have to know about it, and everybody that's involved in analyzing the economy have to think about it. But today, Yellen was very explicit about being cautious, and very deliberate, and she wants to make sure that there's prices on the people go up at least 2% a year, and yet they plus others in government have control of reporting the price increases by the CPI. So that's hardly a reliable indicator, when you think.
Right, it's definitely not. I mean, CPI has been notoriously used and abused as a tool. All these hedonic adjustments, and well, if the price of steak goes up, then you'll just substitute hamburger in the price index. I mean, I think it's pretty clear the standard of living for most people in this country has been at least stagnant, if not decreasing. Money just doesn't go as far, and it's yeah.
Daniel, do you have another question for Paul Merton?
Well, it's interesting what I guess Senator Shelby made some suggestions for reform of the Fed, and I don't know what you would say about the value of those suggestions, but it was interesting to see her reaction to this. She said Congress already dealt with laws on the Fed 100 years ago, and it's all working very well as it is. No reform needed.
No, yeah. I mean, they're going to fight tooth and nail against anything. Even I remember when Audit the Fed was going through, when we first passed it in 2009, as what eventually became part of Dodd-Frank. We made some concessions to that amendment and said, okay, well, if you really have concerns about this, we'll change this part of the bill, we'll change that part of the bill, and it didn't matter. They will dig in their heels against any sort of reform. They will come up with any sort of excuses as to why they are already, working very well, why they're already transparent. They are just not going to accept any more congressional oversight.
Paul Martin, I want to thank you for coming on with us today, and you are the president of the Menger Center. Could you put your website out there or tell us what that is and how that's going?
Yeah, the Carl Menger Center for the Study of Money and Banking is a new think tank that we founded last year, and it's dedicated to teaching the American people about sound money and sound banking. Obviously, the focus is on the Federal Reserve, trying to be kind of a watchdog on the Fed and tell people what the Federal Reserve is, what it does, why it needs to be eventually ended, but in the interim, at least, audited and a lot more transparency. We deal with all sorts of money and banking issues, a little bit with the ECB, European Central Bank, and what's going on over there, because there is a cooperation between the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world. We're just I basically see what the Carl Menger Center does, and the website is mengercenter.org, MENGER center.org. I basically see it kind of as a continuation of what I was doing for you, Dr. Paul, when I worked in your congressional office, which was to focus on education and get these ideas out to the American people so that people will realize exactly what the Fed is, what it's doing, how it's harming our economy, and how it's harming the standard of living for average Americans.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck on your center, and I know you will do well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul.
Right. I want to follow up on who made that quote you just asked about.
Well, it was Senator Shelby.
Shelby about the 100 years. What crossed my mind when he talked about that 100 years was, when she's bragging, we've had these regulations for 100 years and we've done so well, we don't need any tampering. But what do you think about it? How many inflations have they have? How many depressions and how many long recessions that they've had, and the harm done? How much harm have they done for policy? Because without the Fed, they can't finance the runaway spending, the runaway welfareism, and they really can't even finance the wars. Yeah. So it is utterly amazing to me that they can say, well, we've had our regulations for 100 years and we're doing such a good job. But you know what? I think we're passing that stage, because I've always seen the Fed as an instrument that took credit for the good times, and then when they created the bad times, they never took responsibility. They always saved us from the bad times and corrected it. But I don't think they're going to get away with that. I think Audit the Fed, even though they keep using these same old arguments, to me, they don't want transparency, but what they want is secrecy, and they are going to pursue it. But the American people want transparency. And the other argument that Corker used today in the hearings was that this bill, and I know Paul Martin would agree with us on this bill that they're Audit the Fed means that the Congress is going to take over total control and print the money at will. It has nothing to do with it, but they've always used this argument that I don't even want the Congress to take control. Yeah. They should be controlling the purity of coins. That was their job. But anyway, there's a lot of mischief going on. I'm always aggravated with these hearings because they never get to the basic line. They distort all this thing about CPI and prices and call the CPI is the measurement of inflation, but they never talk about malinvestment. You can have zero rate interest rates, and you can have business people doing all sorts of foolish things and savers hurting people. The CPI is okay, so we don't have to worry. But anyway, I think the issue of the Federal Reserve is going to grow in interest. I think it's great that Paul Martin has the center going because this is the secret. I was shocked and pleased about what happened in the campaign when we saw thousands of young people coming out excited about auditing the Fed and studying monetary policy. I ran into teenagers, and they came to our office, frequently. They knew more about the Federal Reserve than most of the members of Congress. So I'm optimistic about this. Besides, this thing isn't going to last, and something has to replace it, and that's why it's so important that we continue this effort. But anyway.
Well, I think as Paul Martin said earlier, a lot of younger people realize they have no future. There's no incentive to save. There's no future for them, and I think that's why so many of them were attracted to your message.
And not too many jobs. Right. Anyway, I would like to thank all the listeners for tuning in to the Ron Paul Liberty Report, and come back soon.